Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very accomplished leader, professional from the US, Mr. Newell Eaton. Newell, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashutosh. It's really a pleasure to meet you and look forward to having this conversation.
Thank you. Newell is a leadership coach. He's a creative group facilitator. So Newell, today we're going to talk coaching. Let me start by asking you, how did you determine that coaching was what you wanted to do?
It's interesting you asked that question. I think coaching discovered me. I didn't really discover coaching. What happened was I had a career for about 27 years, really working in youth development, youth services inside New York State's government. And in that process, I a lot of times was working with the most senior leaders of all kinds of government agencies and became known as this sort of strategic thought partner. So when I retired, I had been working with a coach, and she said, Newell, what you do is coaching. I said, huh? I didn't, I thought of myself as a strategic planner, as a change agent who dealt with systems. And she said, no, what you've been doing all along when you've been meeting with those leaders, the kinds of questions you ask, the way you help engage in creative problem solving with them, we call that coaching.
Okay.
So when I retired, I hung up, I went to a meeting of the American Association of Training and Development, and I stood up to introduce myself, and I said, one of the things I do is leadership coaching. And two people came up to me and said, we need you. That's how it took off. But I still do a lot of team-oriented and strategic planning work as well.
Fascinating. And you have focused your attention on changing the way we as a society, culture, treat young people. Help me understand what you do with an example.
Yeah. First of all, the way I got into that's kind of important to set up that example. I've always been kind of a change agent, an activist. Beginning when I was an exchange student in South America, I really saw so much corruption that it really angered the Boy Scout in me.
Correct.
Right. So when I came back from that, and in Boy Scouts, I had been a leader of young people. I learned, was well trained in leadership of young folks. So when I came back, I got involved in the Vietnam War protest movement. And as part of that, somebody said, hey, Newell, we've got this group of kids we'd like you to work with. Would you be interested in helping them, if inner city kids, helping them create a place to express themselves on walls? So when I worked with them, I realized I had a natural affinity to doing that kind of stuff, working with kids. And they didn't want to do the graphics on the wall. They wanted to play basketball. So I met them where they were at. We played basketball, and then we did some graphics on the wall. And so in that, I started realizing that as a society, we don't look at what great things kids have to offer, teenagers in particular, how do we start thinking about them as problem solvers rather than as problems to solve, because of all the isms of teenage pregnancy and youthful drug abuse and gangs. So I had an orientation, that sort of positive, strengths-based orientation. I may have read about it, but it really came to me. So when I was offered a job to set up a youth center, I went and set up a youth center in a local city. Okay. And so the example is that I started working with kids that had run away from home or were homeless. And I could see there was a tremendous need for that. And it's like, how did I help these kids find out the resources within themselves? That led to people saying, oh, Newell, we need you to come over to a bigger city and set up a youth agency. So I set up a youth agency and did that for a couple of years, and then created a state coalition of youth agencies. And that's what led me into state government, because they wanted someone to organize a new law was passed for runaway and homeless kids. They said, you created that mess, Newell, because I had organized it. Come on in here and run it. And I said I'd stay for 18 months, and then 26 years went by. So, but the example really is that there's so many in that experience that it needs to be a reframe on how we think about adolescence as resources. They're a major untapped resource. And so I've built a whole life of work for years focused on that agenda till I retired.
How amazing. So I've got to ask you this question then, since you worked with young people for 29, 30 years, this is the age of the millennials and the Gen Zs, and they're coming in with an incredible perspective on life and the world and the environment and the climate, etc. I'd love to get your perspective on how has youth evolved in your opinion over the last 3 decades or 4 decades?
That's a fascinating question. I think we sometimes also treat them all like there are these categories, right? And when I interview leaders that are those ages, I meet some 20-year-olds that feel older to me than 60-year-olds in terms of their mindset.
Correct.
So I really don't see it quite as cleanly as the sociological kind of write-ups in the paper. But it is important when I talk to folks about what were your experiences growing up? What was the world like when you were growing up? They started at a very different mindset situation in terms of that. So it's kind of meeting them where they're at, either if in an organizational context, what are the things that they want that are different than what others want? I mean, we certainly, with the pandemic that's happened, the whole great reshuffle as it's starting to be called. A lot of them are appreciating the freedom and see new opportunities. At least that's true in the Western, the cultures that I'm working in, where they see they really don't need to go back to the office.
That's
or
true.
Not, and at least not in many jobs.
That is true. Well said. Well said.
So we're going to see them change and change and change. It's basically how do we help them, all of them, and all ages, really develop more of a growth mindset. If they're stuck in an I know it all, my grandson's 22, right? And he's a brilliant young man, but he's in that know it all phase, right? He hasn't had enough bumps yet to realize that maybe there's some other ways of seeing things. Since I think that's one of the ways we can be helpful is to broaden their perspective.
Well said. Well said. So, Newell, coming back to coaching now, how has your history impacted your coaching philosophy, your style, and your values?
Yeah, I've had a couple of great teachers, that really shaped me. I mean, the first, in an interesting way, I was thinking about it before we were meeting. My mother went to school for child development when I was 9 years old to become a teacher. She had been an artist, and my youngest sister was not. I was 9. My middle sister was born, so she started teaching me about what she was learning in school. I was her first student around child development. And I became curious and fascinated about human development. And I think that really began to shape the philosophy of curiosity about humanity and how humans behave, both individually and in groups, that set the foundation for my coaching orientation. And then when I was, I guess I was 16, my father was a funeral director as well as a jazz musician. Funny, a fun family, right? And he periodically would need someone to sit out on the porch when people would come from the inside the funeral home to come out and smoke on the porch. And in the business, they call it door call, where you stand out there and help people in, but you stand out there. He says, Newell, your job is to listen to their stories.
Okay.
So I got fascinated listening to people talk about the person who had passed away.
Wow.
And so I began to have that caring curiosity, which had really been initially set in place through my mother's orientation to human development. So that really created sort of the philosophical foundation for my coaching. And since then, I was trained by a Gestalt therapist to really start looking at the body more than just the talk. I studied under that. So I became very body-centered in my orientation, body and emotions. We call it the self, the somatic, the emotional, the linguistic, the people's practices and their history. That really creates the foundation for my orientation.
Amazing. What an amazing story. My next question to you, Newell, is what is your story about why coaching matters?
Yeah.
And how did you develop that narrative?
After all my years of trying to promote youth development in government, what I noticed was that business leaders seem to have the most impact on change.
Mm-hmm.
So when I left government, I had a number of consultants that I had hired when I was inside government who said, "Come work for us in the business sector." And I thought I knew nothing about business. And what they told me is, Newell, with the changes you were able to make in government, you're going to find working in business going to be very easy.
Right.
Which turned out to be true, but I didn't believe them at first. But I entered it with the notion that the folks that are having the most impact on the world are leaders in the profit-making sector, somewhat in the nonprofit, but it's independent. And so coaching those leaders so that they would create organizations that were healthy, that people would love to work in, that are good neighbors locally and globally, which becomes even more important with our climate change issues of today. So I've always been kind of a missionary in one form or another.
Right.
So my mission has been really to help shape differences in leadership. And that really has been my passion ever since.
Amazing, amazing. And when again I was reading about you, there are a lot of important people in your life who seem to have shaped you and influenced you. Tell me a little bit about these individuals and how they have shaped you.
Yeah. Well, I spoke already of my parents. I mean, I grew up in a home. We didn't have much money, but we never knew we didn't have much money. It was a very happy childhood. When I'm working with many people who've gone through a lot of suffering and traumas, I didn't have that. My first traumas was a girlfriend broke up with me, kind of a thing, kind of stuff. So being the oldest of five, needing to take care of my siblings, my choir leader at church really got me to singing and got me seeing a big picture. My scout leaders, all of them were formative. And then I had a high school teacher, and my high school was so small that when they wanted to do a play, you didn't try out for it. They came over and they handed you a part and said, "This is the part you're playing." Same was true with the football team. Yeah. The coach came to me and said, "You're going to be the end." So I had adults that surrounded me early on that influenced me. And then once I got to college, I had two college profs that helped me see how to engage in what we called applied anthropology. I started in architecture and quickly decided, I really am more interested in what goes on in buildings. While I love design, than I am in creating buildings. So they really helped shape my thinking about the world and how to make big change and the notion of how to be a change agent. And when I left college, I had a marriage that broke up. And so I was kind of traumatized. So I went and saw a therapist, gestalt bioenergetic therapist. So I studied under him because I thought I was going to become a therapist at that time. And then changed my mind. I was much more street, I would say.
Yeah.
And Ron Kurtz really influenced me to have this sort of awareness of body and emotions in terms of things. And then in more recent terms, Bob Dunham, the guy who is running the Institute for Generative Leadership, the coaching program I went through, had a huge impact in my thinking about my current coaching philosophy and the kind of skill sets that I use. There are many more, but those are the ones that come to mind right now, Ashutosh.
Yep. And yet, Newell, you also say that there is something incomplete from your past that is affecting your ability to be the best coach you can be. Tell me a little bit about this.
It's a great question. I think there are a few. I mean, the one that really strikes me is that I only speak English. I only speak American English. And I had opportunities when I was an exchange student in South America to begin to really learn Spanish, and I never kept that up. And there have been a number of times where I've really been sorry that I'm not bilingual or trilingual. My wife speaks French and a little bit of German, and I'm really envious of that. And I think it limits my perspective in terms of things. The other is that I never really completed any of the degree programs beyond my bachelor for a host of reasons. And I think maybe some university training would have been beneficial. But so those are kind of skill sets. But I think in terms of my inner state, I've described it recently as like, I come across to most people as a very caring human being, someone who's got a big heart, but I still think I've got a wall inside me. There's a stage where, as much as I meditate and as much as I do loving kindness type meditation, I got a limit there that I really want to open up. And so I think that's still my work.
Okay.
It's like, while I deeply engage in thinking about my practices, like the Brahma Viharas from the Buddhist practices, the more I've gone through long silent meditation retreats, I realize there's something holding me back. There's a shadow in there. And that's my work, to really start exploring that.
Wow. One more question, again, with your background. How does the historical context in which you were raised impact your view of yourself, your clients, and your coaching?
Yeah, I'm definitely a product of the 60s, is what we would say about the United States. The Vietnam era, the counterculture. I was very active in all of that, lived in communes. So really learned large group process in a very complex set of environments. That was my adolescence. In the 50s, when I was a little boy, I really had, as I was saying, I really had it pretty good. When I look at all the suffering that I was unaware of that was going on. So I think those were extremely influential. And being a young parent, I had a son when I was 20 years old, who's now, he's one of the loves of my life and my grandkids. Being a young parent, we talk about youth development, I was dealing with that all along. And when I deal with my peers, most of them didn't have their kids till probably 10, 20 years later. So I think being a young parent really had a significant influence. And I split with my first wife. So being sharing parenting cross locations really had an influence, both looking for how to be creative as a parent in that kind of way, but also set some limits. So those are my own history that mattered quite a bit. So, we all have those of one sort or another.
Oh, absolutely. So I'm now going to move to a few questions for you personally, because my viewers and listeners love to get to know my guest a little better. My first question to you, Newell, is that in a life well lived, you've done so many different things. What would you say are 3 key milestones or pivot points in your life or your career?
Yeah, in my life, being an exchange student to South America gave me a perspective. I thought I knew what the world was at 15, and it completely opened me up to realize how little I knew. I became more of what we would call now in the coaching field an I don't know at all. Right?
Correct.
I wish that for my grandson. I wish he could get some of that. And also, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I really saw the corruption of politics and church and economics that existed in the elite, because I was living with some of the most elite people in that country, and made me angry. So that really shaped me. So that was a significant milestone. Becoming a father in the middle of the Vietnam War, and being a protester, and thinking about being a conscientious objector, and the nature of what is life about was another pivot point.
Okay.
And the third was my second marriage, where my second wife became a manic depressive and suicidal.
Oh, okay.
And it was biochemical. And there was nothing I could do about it. And eventually the decision to leave her after being together 25 years, to now the relationship I'm in, which I've now been in 20 years, which has really shaped a whole new life for me. So it's like my chapters of my life are very distinct in that regard. Who I am now is a composite of all those learnings, old warrior of the world in an interesting kind of way. But
what a fascinating journey. And thank you so much for sharing this with me.
yeah.
My next question to you is, in a life well lived with so many different facets to it, what does success mean to Newell?
That story they tell about the kid walking down the beach who's got starfish and he's throwing them in, and the person comes up to him and says, "Why are you doing that? You're not making much of a difference." And he throws the starfish in and he goes, "It makes a difference to that starfish."
I know.
So I really see my life at this stage as, well, I've worked in big systems change for a large chunk of my career. I'm now really focusing on the one-on-ones, one person at a time or a team in organizations in terms of it. So, and I've kind of have my legacy behind me. At 73, I've done a lot of things I'm very proud of, and I could see made a difference. So now it's just all gravy, while the world's a mess still, right? And I'm doing a lot around climate change, activism, and other things. It really is a feeling of, I love to work with people. I love the leaders I get to coach and the teams I get to work with and the things I get to do. It's the issue, Ashutosh, is how to limit it. It's like I say to the world that I'm building my work around my life, not my life around my work. That's my intention. But lately I'm looking at my calendar and it's not so true. So I need to get back in that place.
I agree. And I completely agree with what you're saying, to build my life around my work rather than the other way around.
Right.
That's fantastic. So I've got time for one more question, Newell, and I was thinking about what to ask you, but this question is for the many, many people who will listen to us. What would you say are 3 lessons our viewers and listeners can take back from this conversation?
Yeah, what I think really strikes me is, first of all, and I get this from having been a pitcher, a baseball pitcher, is that the being able to be focusing, if you want to do habit change, or if you really want to get something done, how do you make sure you really are focused? Being really present, being aware. Sounds so easy, very hard, but really is essential. That's number one. The next one I take from, there's one of my favorite teachers is Jennifer Garvey Berger. And in a way, she says a version of, don't believe everything you think. So I really try to ask myself the question I suggest to others, to say, how might I be wrong?
Yeah.
Anytime I'm really feeling I surely know, it's like, let's have that other member of my committee ask that question. And the other is that particularly for leaders, most things we think are problems to solve are really polarities to manage. There's a lot of things that there really isn't a right answer. That it's, there's really that sense that you have to look along. We're on a continuum, particularly in today's world where things are in constant change. But I do want to add a fourth.
Yeah, absolutely.
The fourth, it's a really important to make space for playing. The way we play is the way we live.
Absolutely.
So to make sure that there is a certain amount of, I think we're designed for play. Serious play perhaps, but that's really when you get down to it. I don't know if this will translate internationally, but I sometimes take a quote I think it comes from the 60s, from some TV show. It's like, we're all bozos on the bus of life.
Absolutely.
So let's laugh at ourselves a little bit when we get too damn serious.
Absolutely. You will, on that note, from a baseball pitcher to say to make space for playing, I think what a great way to end a conversation. I've often heard this from many people. I've also said this myself, that we must always remember to have fun in life. And I think that's your message as well. Thank you so much for speaking to me about your incredible journey uh, from a young individual. I loved your story about listening to stories, at a funeral home where your father was a director. I loved your story about how you were an activist and what suddenly got you into coaching. And then it was amazing at how well you were able to relate a lot of your stories to coaching, which you seem to be very, very passionate about. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck.
Thank you for the opportunity, Ashutosh. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.